I like to start my research ideally a few years before I actually start the model. I like to get together the plans, drawings and photos in particular. As you can see, I've built 3 of the C-class destroyers, one of them in World War II, the next one, which is Concord, as she was in the 1950s, and the third one when the class had been fully modernised, as she was in 1962. In order to build those 3 models, I've built up a library of some 500 photos of these particular warships. I find photographs extremely helpful. The big caveat I would add, though, is you need to be fairly sure that the photo is either of the ship that you're going to model or of the class of which the model is won. Quite a lot of the photographs you will find are not of the ship that you want to model, and that can be rather confusing to say the least. Also, the date of the photo is very important. As we all know, warships undergo a lot of modifications in their lifetime. The average warship might only be in service for some 15 to 20 years, but in that time, a lot of changes take place. So you need to decide the particular year that your model is going to be. Hence why I've said one of my models was in 1944, the other one 1950-52, and the third 62. Having studied the plans, the drawings and the photos, you have a model to build. This happens to show the completed model that I made for our chairman. He commissioned me to make it, and I was very pleased to do it. It was an interesting subject. Here's a couple of photos. This is the first one, and the next slide will be the second one of actually HMS Concord. She was a C-class destroyer. These ships, there were 32 of them. They were in 4 subclasses: CA, CH, CO, and CR. They were all emergency wartime destroyers. Most were ordered in 1942. Most of them were laid down in 1943, including Concord. Most of the CAs were finished before the end of the war and therefore served in it. The COs, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, weren't completed, and Concord was finished in 1946. Now, the reason that the ships were delayed, or the COs were delayed, is that they had a different director to the CAs. The CA class had the old K class high angle, low angle director. For the COs, they wanted the Mark VI director control tower, plus powered supply to the main armament. Because of the extra weight of the Mark VI director and the power control of the main armament, a set of the torpedo tubes had to be landed, along with one of the whalers and half the depth charges. As designed, the C-class had a displacement of 1740 tons standard, 2570 tons full load. They had a length of 362 feet and 9 inches and a beam of 35 feet and 9 inches. The speed in standard trim was 36 knots, but at full load, that was 32 knots. The original armament was 4 quick-fire 4.5-inch guns on Mark V mountings. Secondary armament was 40mm Bofors. Originally, one of the Bofors was a Hazelmere mount. I've talked about this in a previous discussion. There were 8 torpedo tubes in 2 banks of 4, and as I've said, in the COs, 1 bank was landed. The original depth charges were 80, but again, that was halved to about 35 or 40. These ships had a complement of 186 officers and men, which was less than the average destroyer, which was more like 200, 250. At the end of the war, we needed to have ships out in the Far East. We were finishing off the war with Japan, and at the particular time, it was expected that war would run till about the end of 1946. But as we all know, the war was ended by the dropping of a couple of atomic bombs, and the Japanese surrendered. But our ships were already in the Far East, and the lesser complement of the C-class destroyers made them a very useful group to have out there, because many of our sailors were hostilities only, and they wanted to be demobbed. Concord was launched as HMS Corso, that's Corso, but she was renamed Concord when she was completed. Her first pennant number was R53, but then at the end of the World War II, it was decided that all destroyers would have a pennant number starting with the letter D. There was already a D53, so Concord became D03. She served in the Far East from 1947 through to 1957 as part of the 8th Destroyer Squadron. In 1949, she was involved with the Amethyst incident. Concord proceeded up the river to meet the sloop coming down the river, and because the sloop had a number of casualties, Concord gave over a number of her sailors to make up the numbers. Concord continued to serve in the Korean War. The model shows her in 1952. This was just before she went to Singapore for a partial modernization and a refit. You can see four drawings. The one on the bottom right is the general arrangement drawing that I worked to. As you can see, although it's useful, it doesn't show the detail that I personally like for making models. So you have to do some research to get the missing bits. And I've put up 3 examples. You can see the twin bofas, a typical depth charge rack for the stern, and a 25-foot motorboat. Again, you need close-up photographs. The general photographs of the ship are fine, but you need detail photos. Here we've got top left, the rear end of a 4.5-inch mounting. Top right, a pair of depth charge throwers. Bottom left, a 40mm twin bofas. And bottom right, depth charge rack. You'll find that you will need to gather together lots and lots and lots of photographs of the various parts of a ship that you need to model. So we've started making the model, and you can see the basic structure on the extreme left. The material is plastic card. I like the material. A lot of people don't, but I love it. It's very easy to mark out, cut to shape, and sand to whatever profiles you want. So if you take the bottom left shot, you can see the waterline keel and one of the stations. You can see, hopefully, the markings I've laid out for the other stations, which do get glued in. The deck is then added. You can see that in the middle photo. At that stage, I've also added in the balsa wood blocking that goes between the stations. And then in the far right photo, the whole lot has been sanded down to shape. Now, sanding down is a messy job, and I usually take the hull outside into the open air, along with the sanding block, planes and other tools I use for shaping. And I just spend a few happy hours outside making a lot of mess. but thankfully the wind blows and it gets rid of it all. Then we come to the hull plating. For this particular model, I used lithoplate. This is a thin aluminium plate. You can obtain it from print shops. They use it for their processes, and they usually don't want any money for it. They hand it to you. The photo is showing the first layer of this material that's been put on. It's glued in place with Yoo-hoo. I like to use Yoo-hoo because it allows a little bit of flexibility for moving the plates around to get them in the right position. And also, as you squeeze down the plate, the excess glue oozes out the edges, and before it dries, you can roll it into little balls and pick it away, and it leaves a nice clean surface. The surface is then sanded for the second layer to be glued in place. Now, I'd like to add a word of warning concerning the glues. Yoo-hoo and the polystyrene cement that I use for gluing the plastic card, these glues both develop heat as they dry. So you need to be very frugal in the use of them. Otherwise, you're risking a distortion taking place. This has happened to me, and I learned the lesson. The hull is basically finished, and we now start on the upper works, deck houses and superstructure. As you can see, I use the egg box form of construction. If the deck that's being added onto the top of the superstructure is fairly thick, I just glue it in place. But if it's a fairly thin deck, for example, where the deck overhangs the superstructure below, I then block it in with balsa wood and sand that down flat, then add the deck. In the left-hand photo, you can see the development of the upper works as they proceeded along. I will just add here that where there is an overhang of the deck, you need to think about what goes underneath, because often you need to do the underneath before you glue the deck in place. Otherwise, you won't have the necessary access. Now, our chairman wanted his model depicted secured to a buoy by a hawser, and he wanted it in Hong Kong harbour. So I had to do some research to come up with photos of the harbour. Again, you can see that in the top right. And I wanted a photo of a destroyer secured to a buoy, which you can see bottom left. Ian and I had a little bit of debate as to the likely colour of the sea in Hong Kong. And eventually I came up with a scheme which we were both happy with, and I think is a fair replica of how the harbour at Hong Kong might well be. Here's a photo of Concord secured to the buoy. Again, it's a useful photo because you can see the hull plating where one layer overlaps the next layer. In terms of making the sea, I use plaster of Paris. It's a very fine plaster. I mix up a quantity in a bowl. Fairly creamy is the base that I like to mix it to. And I work it in place with usually a spoon and a paintbrush. You need to leave it then for a couple of days for it to harden. Incidentally, I forgot to mention that the hull is actually mounted in what is to be the sea before I lay the plaster. The hull is wrapped in cling film, which my wife is happy to let me use. But you may well need to ask permission of your better halves if you follow the same route. Once the plaster has hardened, I release the cling film from the model, unscrew the model, and carefully lift it away, leaving the cling film in place. That's necessary because the cling film sticks to the edges of the plaster, and if you try and lift the model and the cling film together, you're going to pull away lumps of plaster. By doing it the way I do it, you can then unpeel the cling film away from the plaster, roll it into a ball and chuck it in the bin. I'd just like to emphasise the words that you can see on the screen. It is extremely important to study the drawings and the photos together to understand the complexity, not only of the whole ship, but also all the armament and equipment that is on board. I'm fairly experienced and have a lot of knowledge of World War II ships, but even I get surprised by some of the things that are on board. I like to understand the reason for pieces of equipment, how they work, what their function is. I find I can make a much better model of it if I know what it's meant to do. Here's a few photos showing the progress of the model. The middle photo is the starting point. The photo on the left is the second one, and the one on the right is the third one. And you can see how the model gradually develops over the weeks and the months. A couple of further photos of the progress. One top right is before the one to the left, and the one to the left, as you can see, the model is rapidly becoming fully developed. I forgot to mention, in the middle photo, you can see some of the tools that I use. They're fairly simple: a pair of tweezers, a surgeon's scalpel, a pair of dividers, pencil and fingernail sanding blocks, and a metal ruler. I use those virtually every day for some part of the model, and I find them absolutely invaluable. I've got more than obviously one surgeon's scalpel. I've got a range of them with different blades. You need to be very careful because they're extremely sharp, and you need to change the blades fairly often, and it's a process that requires a degree of care. I've no end of cuts on my fingers as a result of slippage, but it's a risk you obviously have to accept. Just be careful. And here's the finished model, ready for handing over to Ian, who is going to arrange the glass case. Some close-up photos. You can see from the midships that the C-class is surprisingly complex and requires a lot of research to get it right. I don't guarantee that's 100% right, but it's as near as I can get it. Here's the bows, similar comments, and likewise for the next shot of photos showing the stern. Again, it's fairly complex. Not entirely happy with the depth charge racks, but they're as good as I can get them. Problem is that working at a 16th scale, everything's extremely small, and it's getting a section that works reasonably well and is reasonably stiff. So my apologies, Ian, if they're not exact, but they are as close as I can possibly get them. You'll see on the stern there, in addition to the depth charge racks, the black objects are the smoke producing canisters, and below the barrel of the 4.5 inch to the above the bollard is another canister for producing smoke, which is ejected through the tubes that you can see laying across the stern deck. And here's a couple of photos that Ian was very kind to send me of the model in its glass case at his home. That completes what I want to say at this stage. Thank you.